To forgive blindly is to release from punishment the very person you yourself have judged deserving of it. Pardon is nothing more than the cancellation of a debt that was truly owed. Seneca of Clementia, Book 2, The Apology Loop.
The first type apologizes so often that the apology itself should alarm you more than comfort you. He cries, he promises, he swears this time will be different, and you want to believe him, because believing hurts less than accepting what is already standing in front of you. But look closer. The apology has become a ritual, repeated after the exact same offense, never followed by any real change in behavior. Picture the partner who raises his voice every few weeks, says something he claims he did not mean, and then spends the following days being the gentlest version of himself you have ever seen, almost as if the softness afterward could somehow erase what the harshness did. Picture the friend who borrows money and forgets to pay it back 3 times in a row, apologizes with real tears on the 4th, and is already planning the 5th request before the tears have dried. Picture the parent who missed every recital, every graduation, every ordinary Tuesday that needed showing up, and now sends a long message every birthday explaining how much he regrets the distance. A message so well written, it could have been used instead to simply close it. Epictetus taught that virtue does not live in a man's words. It lives in the actions he repeats when no one is demanding anything from him. A man who speaks beautifully about change but never produces it has not failed to communicate. He has succeeded perfectly at communication while failing entirely at the only thing communication was supposed to serve. If the words change but the actions remain identical, you are not witnessing remorse. You are watching a rehearsed scene, performed every time consequence gets close enough to matter. Notice how the timing always lines up perfectly. The apology never arrives in the calm middle of an ordinary week, when there is nothing at stake and nothing to lose. It arrives exactly when you were close to leaving, exactly when your silence had finally grown teeth, exactly when continuing to stay was starting to look like a choice rather than a habit. This timing is not a coincidence, and it is not romantic either, no matter how it is dressed up. It is a survival instinct belonging entirely to the relationship as he wants it to remain, not to you. Ask yourself without mercy how many cycles you have already lived inside this same pattern: the offense, the tears, the forgiveness, the forgetting, and then the offense again, almost identical in shape to the one before it, only with new details to make it feel unfamiliar enough to excuse. It is no coincidence that every apology feels sincere in the exact moment it is spoken, because sincerity in the moment was never the test. The test was always what happened a month later, when the audience was gone and the stakes had quietly returned to normal. There is a reason this particular trap is so effective, and it has little to do with weakness on your part. Hope is one of the most expensive things a person can spend, and you are not spending it on who he is. You are spending it on who he could be if he meant it this time, a version of him you have built carefully out of his best 5 minutes rather than his average month. The mind treats inconsistent reward as more compelling than consistent reward, which is precisely why a relationship that swings between harm and tenderness can feel more gripping than one that simply stays calm, even though calm was the thing you actually needed all along. This is not cynicism, it is simply pattern recognition applied to a part of life where pattern recognition is too often suspended in the name of love. A genuine apology does not need to be loud, and it almost never needs repeating, because its proof lives in what stops happening afterward, not in what gets said afterward. If you find yourself collecting an increasingly polished vocabulary of remorse from the same person, each apology slightly more eloquent than the last, treat that eloquence as a warning rather than reassurance. The words are improving because the performance keeps needing to work harder, not because the person delivering it is changing underneath it. And while you continue absolving the ritual, it will keep being rewritten, with you always cast in the same role, waiting for a final act that the story was never actually written to include. There is a second type, quieter than this one, who does not even need to fake remorse because he already knows with cold precision that you will come back regardless of whether he asks you to.
The strategic exploiter of your forgiveness.
The second type never begs. Because begging would require effort he has learned he does not need. He has studied your pattern more carefully than you have ever studied your own limits. He knows exactly how much silence you can tolerate before you give in, knows which sentence reopens a door you swore you had locked, knows that your kindness runs on a predictable schedule, and he simply waits for that clock to strike the right hour. Picture the co-worker who pushes past every boundary you set, watches you grow distant for a week, and then shows up with the exact joke that always makes you laugh, delivered on the exact day your distance was about to become permanent. Picture the family member who only calls when an event on the calendar guarantees your presence, never once when nothing is required of you, and somehow always knows the precise number of weeks your resentment needs before it softens enough to answer the phone again. Picture the partner who disappears emotionally for months, then reappears the night before an anniversary. You had quietly stopped expecting him to remember, as if instinct alone told him exactly how close you were to closing the account for good. Marcus Aurelius wrote that no one can wound you without your consent, but there is a more dangerous kind of consent than the one given openly. The open kind is at least a decision, weighed and chosen with your eyes on it. The automatic kind is granted without you even noticing, because it has quietly become habit, a default setting installed so gradually you forgot it was ever optional. This person does not seek your forgiveness the way someone seeks reconciliation, hoping to repair something broken between equals. He seeks it the way someone seeks access, hoping only to be let back inside a door that was never supposed to require so little to open. Every time you open that door exactly when he expected you to, you confirm something he already suspected. That control over the relationship's rhythm never actually left his hands. He is not guessing when he reaches out. He is executing a plan built entirely on data you supplied, without realizing you were the one supplying it. This is what makes this type more unsettling than the first. The apologizer at least performs effort, however hollow. This type does not need to perform anything, because he has already calculated that performance would be wasted energy on a result he considers guaranteed. The dichotomy of control, so central to Stoic thought, was meant to protect your reactions from other people's actions, drawing a clean line between what belongs to you and what belongs to the world outside you. But here, that very principle has been turned against you, weaponized by someone patient enough to study the line itself. He has learned your reaction so precisely that he has converted it into a lever, something he can pull at will, confident in exactly how far it will move you and exactly how long that movement will last before it needs pulling again. There is a way to test whether you are dealing with this type rather than someone genuinely working to repair things with you. Genuine effort tends to arrive when it is inconvenient for the person making it, not only when it is convenient for receiving forgiveness. Genuine effort changes the pattern itself, not merely the timing of the same unchanged pattern. If every reconciliation seems to land at the exact moment your patience was about to expire and nothing about the underlying behavior shifts in the weeks that follow, you are not watching repair, you are watching maintenance. The minimum input required to keep an arrangement running exactly as it already was. Recognizing this is not an invitation to distrust everyone around you, and it is not a demand that you become unreachable or cold toward people who genuinely care for you. It is simply a refusal to remain predictable for someone who only loves you within the exact limits of your availability, who has confused your patience for an inexhaustible resource rather than the limited, costly thing it actually is. Becoming slightly less legible to a person who studies you this closely is not manipulation in return. It is the simple act of reclaiming a rhythm that was never supposed to belong to anyone but you. There is a third type, even quieter than this one, who does not manipulate your return at all. He does not need you to come back because his entire strategy depends on something far more patient than timing, on making sure you never grow large enough to consider leaving in the first place.
The sacred architect of your stagnation.
The third type does not hurt you with shouting, he hurts you with invisible breaks. Every time you announce a new plan, he finds a reasonable-sounding reason to doubt it. Every time you grow, he remembers some detail from your past that, according to him, should keep you realistic. There is no open hostility in this kind of relationship, only a thin chain, almost invisible, tied around your ankle. and he tightens it with such gentleness that it takes years before you notice you are walking slower than you should. Picture the older sibling who responds to every new ambition with a story about how that exact thing failed for someone else, never once with curiosity about why it might work for you. Picture the longtime friend who, the moment you mention starting something new, suddenly remembers an old version of you who once struggled, as if that struggling version were the only true and permanent you, and every later version were simply a performance waiting to be exposed. Picture the partner who calls your excitement naive, your ambition exhausting, your confidence a phase, framing every objection as concern for your well-being, when the actual concern is for a comfort that depends entirely on you staying exactly where you already are. Seneca observed that some friendships do not shelter us from the storm, they keep us inside it, because another person's calm depends entirely on your uncertainty. A friend who only feels secure while you remain unsure of yourself has built his peace on the unstable ground of your hesitation, and any sign that you might finally stand without him threatens the entire arrangement. This is not friendship functioning correctly, no matter how long it has lasted or how much shared history sits underneath it. Duration is not proof of value, it is only proof of time spent, and time spent can just as easily describe a wound that never properly closed as it can describe something worth keeping. This type does not need you to fail spectacularly. He only needs you to never outgrow the size he has already learned to tolerate. Spectacular failure would actually be inconvenient for him, since it would require visible involvement and might even draw sympathy back toward you. What he needs is something quieter and far more sustainable. A permanent, comfortable plateau, just successful enough that you never leave entirely, just uncertain enough that you never outgrow needing his approval. The hegemonikon, the rational faculty that governs your choices, is exactly what this kind of bond tries to weaken, replacing your own honest assessment of the facts with the cautious, self-interested assessment of someone who fears watching you become larger than the space he currently occupies in your life. Every doubt he plants sounds reasonable in isolation, which is precisely what makes the pattern so difficult to name. No single comment qualifies as obvious sabotage. It is only when you stack every comment from the last several years side by side that the shape of the cage finally becomes visible. There is a way to separate this type from someone who is simply honestly cautious because they care about you. Honest caution offers specific, addressable concerns and grows quiet once those concerns are met, even if it takes time to fully trust the outcome. This type's doubt never resolves, no matter how thoroughly you address it, because the doubt was never actually about the plan. It was about the threat the plan represented to him. Watch what happens after you succeed, despite the warning. Honest caution adjusts and grows proud. This type finds a new objection almost immediately, because the goal was never accuracy, the goal was containment. Ask yourself who in your life celebrates your wins with a smile that arrives a second too late, who changes the subject just slightly too quickly after congratulating you, who somehow always needs reminding of how far you have come, as if your progress were a fact requiring repeated proof, rather than something plainly visible to anyone watching honestly. That delay, that subtle deflection, is the truth, spoken without a single word, and it is usually more reliable than anything said out loud. There is a fourth type, who does not sabotage your growth at all. He simply vanishes the exact moment you need him most, and reappears, right on schedule, the day everything finally works out.
The fair-weather loyalist.
The fourth type shows up exactly when there is something to celebrate, and disappears the moment there is something to carry. He texts the day you get the promotion, calls the night you sign the deal, posts the photo when the wedding goes well, but somehow never finds the time when the diagnosis comes back wrong, when the relationship ends, when the bill cannot be paid. Picture the friend group that fills your feed with congratulations the day you launch something new. The same group that goes silent for weeks once that same venture quietly struggles, as if attention were a reward reserved only for outcomes already guaranteed to succeed. Picture the relative who proudly introduces you at family gatherings during the good years, using your achievements as conversation pieces, and somehow becomes unreachable the year you need an honest reference, a place to stay, or simply someone willing to sit with you while things fall apart. Picture the colleague who is first to praise your win in the meeting, eager to be seen standing beside success, and is nowhere to be found the week you actually need someone to vouch for you when it costs them something to do it. Seneca, in his letters, drew a sharp line between a true friend and a man who simply enjoys your company when your company is convenient, warning that the second kind reveals himself fully the moment fortune turns against you. He wrote about men who flock toward whoever currently holds favor and scatter the instant that favor disappears, not because they are uniquely cruel, but because their attachment was never to the person, only to the position the person happened to occupy. This is not loyalty. It is timing dressed up as loyalty, and timing is the easiest thing in the world to fake when nothing is actually being risked. What makes this type so difficult to confront is that he never technically lies about caring, and he rarely does anything dramatic enough to justify outrage. He simply arrives late enough and leaves early enough that he is never present for the part that actually costs him something. There is no single moment you can point to and call betrayal, only an accumulating pattern of absences during exactly the seasons when presence would have meant something, surrounded by an abundance of presence during exactly the seasons when it meant almost nothing at all. Genuine constraint looks different from this pattern, and the difference is worth naming honestly, because not every absence during a hard season is evidence of fair weather loyalty. A person dealing with their own crisis, their own grief, their own limited capacity, may show up imperfectly without that imperfection being calculated. The distinction lives in effort and acknowledgement. Someone genuinely constrained tends to name the gap, apologize for the timing, and make some visible attempt to close the distance once they are able. The fair weather type does neither. He simply resumes contact once the difficult season has passed, as though the gap never happened, expecting full access to the celebration without ever having to account for his absence during the cost. A Stoic does not measure a relationship by how loudly someone celebrates your highest moment, since celebration costs nothing and risks nothing, but by whether that same person remains seated beside you in your lowest one without needing applause for staying. Presence during hardship is the only kind of presence that actually proves anything, because it is the only kind purchased at a price. Anyone can enjoy standing next to your success. Far fewer are willing to sit quietly inside your difficulty, offering nothing more glamorous than their attention and their time, two of the only resources that cannot be faked. Ask yourself honestly, who has actually been there for your defeats, not just your victories, and resist the temptation to round generosity up simply because someone was warm during the easy parts. The answer separates the people worth keeping from the ones merely borrowing your good moments for their own comfort, attaching themselves to your shine without ever offering any light of their own when the room goes dark. There is a fifth type, far more exhausting than this one, who never disappears at all but turns every single thing he ever gave you into a debt you are expected to spend the rest of your life repaying.
The guilt architect.
The fifth type never lets a single sacrifice pass without quietly recording it. He gave you a ride once, and 3 years later, it still surfaces in an argument as proof of everything he has done for you. He helped you through one hard month and now expects unlimited access to your time, your patience, your loyalty, as if that single act of kindness purchased a debt with no expiration date. Picture the parent who reminds you, every time you set even the smallest boundary, of every meal cooked and every sacrifice made decades ago, as though raising a child were a loan rather than a responsibility freely chosen. Picture the partner who covered a difficult month financially once, and now treats every disagreement as a referendum on your gratitude, as if love itself was something that could be paid off and then owned outright. Picture the mentor who opened one door for you early in your career and now expects loyalty so absolute that questioning him, even years later, and even when he is wrong, feels like betraying the very debt that made your success possible. Marcus Aurelius taught that the truly generous man gives and forgets, the way a vine produces grapes without demanding applause for the harvest, expecting nothing back from the very thing it was designed to offer freely. Seneca went further still in his writing on benefits, arguing that the moment a gift requires constant reminding to remain a gift, it has already stopped being one. A real act of generosity closes itself the instant it is given. What this type offers instead is something else entirely. A transaction disguised in the language of generosity, kept permanently open, with him as the only one allowed to decide when or whether it is ever considered repaid. This is part of why the pattern is so difficult to interrupt. Confronting it rarely feels like setting a simple boundary. It feels like attacking an entire identity, since he has built so much of his self-image around the act of giving itself, rarely around the relationship that giving was supposed to nurture in the first place. This type gives in order to remember, and remembers in order to collect. Every gesture becomes evidence in a ledger. Only he is allowed to read, updated silently, audited whenever it becomes useful to him, and produced as testimony the moment you attempt to assert any need of your own. Every time you fail to repay fast enough or fully enough, you are reminded, sometimes gently and sometimes cruelly, of exactly what you supposedly owe, as though gratitude were a currency that could be measured down to the exact transaction and the exact amount still outstanding. The Stoics placed favors, money, and even affection among the things considered indifferent, not because they do not matter, but because allowing someone else's account of your debt to dictate your peace hands them ownership over something that should remain entirely yours, your own sense of what you owe and to whom. The moment another person's ledger becomes the standard by which you measure your worth as a son, a partner, or a friend, you have effectively outsourced your own judgment to someone with every incentive to keep the balance forever in his favor. Notice how guilt, once it takes root, rarely announces itself directly. It does not usually arrive as an accusation. It arrives as a sigh, a pointed silence, a story told just loudly enough for you to hear about how much easier life used to be before you started asking for things, a comment about how grateful other people seem compared to you. It simply makes you feel like the villain every time you try to set a boundary with the person who claims to have given you everything, recasting your healthy limits as ingratitude and your self-respect as betrayal. There is a meaningful difference between this and genuine reciprocity, and the test is simple, even when the feeling is not. Healthy giving expects nothing specific in return and remains warm even when nothing is given back immediately. This type's giving always arrives with strings attached so fine you rarely see them until you try to move freely and feel the tug. Ask yourself whether the kindness you received years ago is still actively being spent against you today. And if it is, recognize that what looks like a relationship may actually be an unpaid invoice you never agreed to sign. There is a sixth type, quieter still, who does not need a ledger at all because what you actually resent in him is not him. It is the version of yourself you became while tolerating people exactly like him.
The mirror of misplaced mercy.
The sixth type is strange because the anger he provokes in you rarely matches the size of what he actually did. You forgave someone smaller, years ago, for something almost identical and barely felt a thing. So, why does this version of the same betrayal feel unbearable? Picture the new coworker who interrupts you in meetings and somehow ignites a fury in you that feels disproportionate to a habit most people would simply find mildly annoying, until you remember the manager years ago who interrupted you constantly while you said nothing, swallowing the disrespect to keep the peace and keep the paycheck. Picture the new partner who goes quiet for 2 days after an argument, a silence that sends you into a spiral far beyond what 2 days of silence should reasonably cause, until you remember the relationship before this one, where silence stretched for weeks, and you learn to apologize first just to end it, regardless of who was actually wrong. Picture the friend who cancels plans at the last minute, and the wave of fury that follows feels strangely disconnected from a single cancelled dinner, until you remember the friendship in your 20s, where you were cancelled on so often that you eventually stopped making plans worth cancelling at all. Epictetus said that what disturbs us is rarely the event itself, but the judgment we attach to it, and the judgment hiding underneath this particular anger is not about the present person at all. It is about every version of you that once tolerated this for far too long. The current offense is small. The accumulated weight behind your reaction is not. You are not overreacting to what is happening now. You are finally reacting all at once to everything you failed to react to then, and the timing simply happens to land on someone who may not even deserve the full weight of that delayed response. Watching someone repeat your old mistakes, your old silences, your old willingness to excuse the inexcusable, forces you to confront a self you would rather forget you ever were. It is uncomfortable to watch a current version of an old story being told again, with a different cast, because it reminds you uncomfortably clearly that the person making this particular mistake right now used to be you. And some part of you has not yet finished forgiving that earlier version for taking so long to leave, to speak up, to stop excusing what should never have been excused in the first place. This is amor fati in its hardest form, not loving what happened to you, which would ask too much of anyone, but refusing to disown the person you had to be before you became who you are now. Disowning your past self does not erase what happened to her, it simply leaves her unprotected. Abandoned twice, once by the person who hurt her, and again by the very person she eventually became, who would rather pretend she never existed than sit with how long she stayed. There is, paradoxically, something almost reassuring buried inside this kind of overreaction, if you know how to read it correctly. The intensity of your anger is, in its own strange way, a measurement of how far you have already traveled since the version of you who tolerated this the first time. The old you would not have recognized the offense at all, would have absorbed it quietly and called it normal, perhaps even defended the person doing it. The fact that it now registers as intolerable is evidence of standards that did not exist before, even if those standards are currently aiming themselves at someone who may not fully deserve the entire weight of them. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that you are being unfair to the person in front of you right now. It is a sign that healing is incomplete, that some part of you is still negotiating with a version of yourself who deserved better and never got it. A useful practice here is separating the reaction from the trigger. Ask what percentage of this anger belongs to the actual event in front of you, and what percentage arrived already loaded, carried over from somewhere older. If the number leans heavily toward the past, the person standing in front of you is not your real target, only the nearest available surface for something that has been waiting a long time to land somewhere. This does not mean the present offense should be excused simply because old wounds are involved. It means the response should be sized correctly, addressing what is actually happening now, while the larger grief underneath gets directed toward healing rather than toward whoever happens to remind you of it. And this brings us to the seventh type, the one this entire video has been building toward, the one whose existence redefines everything you thought you understood about mercy.
The one forgiveness would insult.
The seventh type does not slip up by accident, and his actions are not, in any honest sense, born of ignorance. He understood precisely what he was doing the entire time, weighed the cost to you against the benefit to himself, and chose his own comfort with full awareness of what it would cost you. Picture the friend who knew exactly how exhausted you were, calculated that your exhaustion made you unlikely to push back, and took advantage of that calculation instead of respecting it. Picture the partner who understood precisely which words would wound you the deepest, used them anyway, and felt nothing close to surprise when they landed exactly where intended. Picture the business associate who knew the contract was unfair before you signed it, said nothing, and later admitted almost casually that he assumed you would have done the same thing in his position. None of these people stumbled into harm. They walked toward it deliberately, with full visibility of the road they were on. Marcus Aurelius believed something that complicates this entire video, and it deserves to be said honestly rather than smoothed over for convenience. In his private writings, composed for no audience but himself, he insisted that almost everyone who wrongs us does so out of ignorance of what is truly good, not out of deliberate malice, and that remembering this should soften our anger rather than feed it. Each morning he told himself to expect thoughtless and ungrateful people, and to remember that their behavior came from confusion about what actually mattered, not from clear-eyed cruelty. This is for the most part true, and it is one of the most freeing ideas Stoicism has to offer. Most of the harm done to you across your lifetime was probably never calculated at all. It came from people confused about what mattered, repeating patterns they inherited without ever examining them, mistaking their own comfort for righteousness because no one had ever forced them to look closer. Extending grace to confusion like that is not weakness. It is precisely the clarity Marcus Aurelius spent his private writings practicing on himself before he ever practiced it on Rome. But Seneca, writing a generation earlier to a far less reflective student, drew a line that this framework leaves unfinished. In his treatise on mercy, addressed to a young emperor who held the power of life and death over every citizen in Rome, Seneca separated two Latin words that most people today treat as though they meant the same thing. The first is ignoscere, blind pardon, releasing someone from consequence without ever weighing what they actually did. The second is Clementia, mercy exercised with discernment, judging each case on its own evidence instead of handing out forgiveness as a uniform policy. Seneca's distinction was precise. To forgive blindly is to release from punishment the very person you yourself have judged deserving of it. Pardon in that sense is nothing more than the cancellation of a debt that was genuinely owed. This is the rule almost no one teaches when they speak of forgiveness as an unconditional virtue. Clementia does not ask you to pretend the debt never existed. It asks you to look directly at what happened, decide honestly whether you are facing confusion or calculation, and respond accordingly. Confusion deserves the patience Marcus Aurelius extended every single morning before he had even left his bed. Calculation deserves something else entirely, not cruelty, not a lifetime of resentment, but the clear-eyed refusal to call it anything other than exactly what it was. There is a particular kind of person worth watching for here. The one who, when finally confronted, does not deny what he did or claim he never understood the consequences. He simply shrugs, sometimes even admits it plainly, and explains that he would likely do the same thing again, given the same incentives. That admission is not honesty redeeming him, it is confirmation of exactly which category he belongs to, and exactly why ignoscere was never built for someone like him. This does not mean carrying hatred for the rest of your life. Hatred is its own prison, consuming the one who carries it far more thoroughly than the one it is aimed at, and the Stoics rejected it as thoroughly as they rejected pardon without discernment. What Clementia asks for instead is harder than either extreme, a clear-eyed acceptance of exactly what happened, exactly who did it, and exactly why it will never again be granted the same access to your trust. You are allowed to release the anger without releasing the lesson. You are allowed to stop carrying the wound without pretending it was never inflicted, and without pretending the person who inflicted it deliberately has earned a second opportunity simply because enough time has passed for the memory to feel less sharp. That is the rule. Not ignoscere for everyone, and not Clementia for no one, but Clementia for confusion and the plain refusal to dress up calculation as confusion ever again. Carry that distinction with you into everything we have already covered, because it changes how you remember every single person discussed in this video, separating those who genuinely did not know better from those who knew exactly what they were doing and decided your peace was an acceptable price to pay.
Finally, consider everything you have walked through today. 7 faces, each one wearing the disguise of a relationship while quietly working against your peace. The apologizer trapped in a ritual of words without change. The strategist who turned your patience into a lever. The architect who needed you small to feel secure. The loyalist who only appeared for applause. The collector who turned every kindness into an unpaid debt. The mirror who forced you to confront the version of yourself who once stayed too long. And the 7th, the one who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. None of them require your hatred. All of them require your discernment. The Stoic who refuses to forgive blindly is not a colder version of himself. He is simply someone who finally understands that mercy without judgment is not virtue. It is abandonment of the very self that virtue was meant to protect. So, before you grant the next second chance, ask one question first. Is this person asking to be understood because they genuinely did not know better? Or are they hoping you mistake a calculation for an accident? Tell me in the comments which of these 7 you recognized first, because chances are you already know exactly who came to mind.